Hello everyone. Okay, so this lesson is to go over the Austrian business cycle theory and to compare it and contrast it with two other common models that you already know, namely the Keynesian model and the classical model, at least the classical model as it's related to the equation of exchange. So let's get started. So the first thing to know is that the Austrian model rejects aggregation. That is, you might think back in the Keynesian model where you had aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and the economy was kind of driven by aggregate demand, and aggregate supply always followed. In fact, all that monetary and fiscal policy is really about manipulating aggregate demand to move the economy one way or another. So the Austrian model rejects all of that, not just the aggregation that you would see there, but also things like the price level. So you know, in the equation of exchange, MV equals PQ, you have that term, the price level, and that's an aggregated price. And the Austrian model would also reject that. They would say instead that what's important is the individual demands from individual markets and the individual prices and so forth. So just from the get-go, they reject aggregation, which puts them very, very different from the Keynesian model and all of the various forms of the classical model that you might see. So in order to sort of get an understanding of the Austrian business cycle theory, the best way I know is through a rudimentary illustration using simple supply and demand. So that's what we're going to try to do. So first, imagine two markets, one that's sensitive to changes in the interest rate and one that's not. So a market that's sensitive to the changes in the interest rate would be something like home purchase or home repair or home construction and all the things that are related to that. So like the companies that manufacture shingles or plywood or concrete or nails or any of those related industries would all be very sensitive to changes in the interest rate, because when interest rates go down and people purchase homes by borrowing money, the demand curve for those products would go up. So we have an interest sensitive market and we have a non-interest sensitive market. So a non-interest sensitive market would be something like maybe food or health care or entertainment, things that you would decide how much to purchase and the current interest rate wouldn't matter. So I doubt you would ever say, oh gee, the interest rate's gone up, so I'm going to buy less groceries than before. So we have two markets, one that's sensitive to changes in the interest rate and one that's not, and we have an equilibrium price and quantity in both cases. Now imagine that the Federal Reserve takes some action to lower the interest rate. What impact would this have on our two markets? Notice that in the Keynesian model there would be no discussion of the impact in two markets because everything is aggregated up. There would just be the discussion of what happens to aggregate demand. But in the Austrian business cycle theory, a distinction is made. So in the interest sensitive market, what would happen obviously is that the demand curve would increase. And when the demand curve increased, there'd be a new equilibrium price and quantity, and the price would go up and output would go up in the interest sensitive market. So in the Austrian business cycle theory, this is called the boom period, because there's more employment, prices are up, stock prices are up, profits are up, everything is good. At least in the interest sensitive market, everything is good in this period. Now the question becomes, well, where do the extra resources come from? You see this increase in output down here? Where did the labor, where did the raw materials, where did the extra resources come from to produce all this extra output? In the Keynesian view of things, there's always this kind of slack in the economy, or maybe a better way to put it is there's always this pool of unemployed or underutilized factories and so forth. So the extra output, the extra labor and so forth will always come from that pool of unemployed. But in this one way, the Austrian business cycle theory looks a little bit like classical economics, and that is that they don't really think there is such a pool. They think that all resources have alternative uses. And so what actually happens is that those extra resources are bid away from the non-interest sensitive market. So our supply curve has shifted back to the left as resources have been bid away from the non-interest sensitive market over to the interest sensitive market. Perhaps a good way to understand this would be, imagine that you were working at a grocery store maybe over in Ladson, which is a small town near our campus, and you're making something around the minimum wage, and you get a phone call from your cousin who's maybe working construction in Atlanta, and your cousin says, "Whoa, man, we're making like $20 an hour over here, and we got more work than we can do. Here, move to Atlanta and make $20 an hour and give up that lame job you have working at the grocery store over in Ladson." And so little by little, resources would be bid away from the non-interest sensitive market, and of course a new equilibrium would be established there. And notice that prices have gone up in the non-interest sensitive market just like they did in the interest sensitive market, but in the interest sensitive market output increased, but in the non-interest sensitive market outputs decreased. So in the Austrian view, what really happens when the Fed takes action to stimulate the economy, maybe by lowering interest rates, is it stimulates some markets, namely the interest-sensitive markets, but at the expense of other markets. Resources are bid away from one market and into another. Now, the question becomes, well, what happens next? Notice we have prices have gone up, so there's been inflation. The Fed can't maintain this unnaturally low interest rate forever, so eventually they'll have to reverse their policy and let interest rates return to their more normal level. And when they do that, the demand curve for the interest-sensitive product will shift back to the left like it was before, and instead of the price rising, the price now falls, and output then of course returns to its original level. This is called the bust part of the Austrian business cycle theory. You had the boom and now the bust, and that is workers are being laid off, contracts are being canceled, resources are laying idle, and people who have generally made plans, say in the construction industry, to use my example, now all of a sudden find that they don't have any work. It's quite painful. Now, in the classical view of how things work, all of this adjustment process happens pretty quick, and so while it might be painful, the time period of adjustment would be very short. And in this one way, the Austrian business cycle theory looks a little bit like Keynesian economics in that they claim that this adjustment process will take some time and the pain will linger for quite a while as all of those goods that were produced that were really unsustainable at that unnaturally low interest rate have to sort of find their way through the marketplace and get repurposed for other things. So as all those resources that are laid off finally work their way back into other markets, they will end up in some of the non-interest sensitive markets, which will cause that supply curve to fall back to where it was before. That is, as the worker who moved to Atlanta finally figures out, this was a bad idea, here I am in Atlanta, but I don't have any work, and the worker moves back, say to Ladson, and gets their old job back and so forth, supply curve will return, and the price in the non-interest sensitive market will return to its original level, and output will return. So this is called the bust period, while it's quite painful for all these adjustments to occur. Now, the Austrian business cycle theory will go farther and say what happens next is that the Federal Reserve will again take action to lower interest rates and begin the cycle over and over and over again. And I've left you a little video that I didn't produce, but a little cartoon video that I found that sort of shows that cycling nature. So finally, let's get a little summary of what's going on here. So first, unlike the Keynesian and classical models, the Austrian business cycle model rejects aggregation in all of its forms now, not just aggregate demand and aggregate supply, but also the concept of a price level. But, like the classical model, the Austrian model assumes all resources have alternative uses. That is, resources aren't laying idle like they're assumed to be in the Keynesian model. So when the interest-sensitive industry was stimulated, the resources that they needed for that extra output had to come from somewhere, and in the Austrian business cycle theory, they are drawn away from other markets. And finally, like the Keynesian model, market adjustments take time. That is, they don't happen quickly like it's assumed that they do in the classical model. That it takes a while for workers and producers to realize that, to use my example of home construction, it takes a while for them to figure out that the housing market is not going to return to its original level, and those resources and workers finally find employment in other areas. Okay, so that's the Austrian business cycle theory. Hope you found this helpful. And yeah, there I am. So good luck as you prepare for our next exam.